Hey everyone, welcome to our virtual renewal. I'm glad that you're joining us today. Obviously, due to many of the restrictions around travel and meetings that have come out over the last couple days and couple weeks, we've been working really hard here at CPI to try to provide you with some different options and ways that we can help you to meet your needs and continue the training. So I'm really excited that we've created this virtual renewal option for you to help you maintain your certification and to continue doing what we all do best, which is training. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Jeff Schill, and I am the Vice President of Training here at CPI. I am ready to deliver our inaugural program here around the virtual training. I'm ready to get started. So our plan today is to really look at things through the lens of an instructor. You were all able to take the online portion of the program where we reviewed the content. So this today is really about, let's look at that content from instructor lens. We're all instructors, we're all out there training. So I'm hoping we can look at it from an instructor lens and learn and grow from one another. As instructors, we have some huge responsibilities that we always want to continue to grow and make that material come alive. We do more than just train. We have to teach content and teach material, but we also need to make that content and that material come alive for our participants and really get them excited to leave our trainings and go back and implement the strategies that we teach them. And that's ultimately the hard part of the training. The content, the material becomes the easy part. The hard part is how do we really make that come alive. So that's what today is all about. We're going to look at each of the units, dive in from an instructor perspective and say, how can we make this material even more impactful back at our facilities? So let's look at some of the protocol for this training. We are using a question and answer box. I know there's a chat box and question and answer. We're going to ask that you use the question and answer box that comes directly to us, and that way we can respond to any of the questions or comments that you have throughout today. And we're actually going to be asking for some of your interaction throughout this presentation, so that way you can type that in and we can respond to some of those questions that you may have. To test this function out and to also allow us to take attendance and for you to get credit for this course, why don't we try that right now? If you don't mind taking a moment, going to that question and answer and just type in your name for us, so that way we can see that everyone is using that function, and that also allows us to take some attendance today. So just take a minute to find that question and answer and type in your name. All right, as you're doing that, I'll just go through some of the other ground rules of the program. Your microphone will be muted along with your video. These functions are turned off just to make sure that everything runs smoothly today. So again, if you do need to correspond with us or you have any questions, that's what that question and answer box is for. I'm also going to ask that you have your instructor guide with you. If we're going to focus on this from the lens of an instructor, let's have our material with us, so that way you can take some notes, jot down some ideas, hopefully some takeaways that you can start to implement in your training. So if you have your instructor guide with you, that would be great to have that to take some notes. And if you are having trouble with anything today, any of the videos or any of the things doesn't seem to play, or you're having some technology problems, don't panic. We are recording this and we will make this available to you after the program. So you will have access to things if anything doesn't turn out perfectly. All right. Let's look at the agenda. Specifically, what do we want to cover today and what do we want to go over? We are going to be looking at a variety of units within this program, starting with the crisis development model. The crisis development model is our foundation, and we're going to look at why that was established as our foundation, and ultimately how can we use that in our trainings to provide structure for our learners. We know that adult learners learn best in a structured environment, and the crisis development provides that foundation and structure for this training for us to teach from. We're also going to look at communication and the first 2 units after the crisis development model, units 2 and 3, which are nonverbal and paraverbal communication. And we're going to talk about why is communication important to a crisis situation and how we can really emphasize that use of things like personal space, body language, haptics or touch to really de-escalate a crisis situation. So ultimately, we're going to talk about that power of communication. We're then going to move into the verbal escalation continuum, which I think is one of the most misunderstood models that we have. And we're going to take a look again, much like the crisis development model, what's the purpose of the verbal escalation continuum, and how can we use that to fit within the structure that we have to continue to grow our trainings. We're going to look at making decisions. This is something that's all the way throughout the program, kind of a theme that comes through, but we specifically have some units in the middle of the program around the decision-making matrix that focuses on decisions. So we're going to talk about why is decision-making so important in a crisis, and how can we help our staff members to make appropriate decisions in those high energy output chaotic moments of a crisis. We will be looking at our disengagement and holding. I have 2 colleagues, Stephen and Christina, who are going to be joining me today. And we're going to look at utilizing some videos and also demonstrating here live for you today our disengagement and holding and focusing on the principles and the teaching of those skills. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with our post-crisis, where we are going to look at a few scenarios and practice how we can use the concepts in that post-vention stage to our advantage, and how we can help our staff use those skills as well. So we're going to make our way through the program, looking a little bit deeper at all of those levels. So just to kind of set the stage as to where we're at in this renewal process. You did start by taking the online course to review that content and review that material. You then joined this morning. You were introduced to one of our global instructors who's going to be your personal coach throughout this process. That's going to be the person that you can reach out to and contact, and is going to be able to help you and assist you throughout this renewal stage. You've met them this morning, and now you are joining our virtual class. This is being run live here at CPI Studios, where we are going through that content and going to be looking from a trainer perspective. This will be followed up this afternoon by an online exam, and then over the course of Thursday and Friday, you are going to connect again with your one-to-one coach, where they will walk you through some of the things that we talked about today and look at a few teachbacks from the content and from the physical components after you've seen things today. And again, hopefully as a way to help grow you and build you up as an instructor to make our trainings even more impactful. Once we go through those stages, you are then renewed as an instructor for the next 2 years. All right, so to start with things, now that we have the lay of the land and the agenda and where we're going, I always like to start with why do we do what we do? I think that's really important as trainers. We spend a lot of energy getting up in front of our staff and getting up in front of our team. And like we said, not just training content and material, but actually really winning them over on that content, getting them to really buy in and feel comfortable enough that they can walk out and use those skills. That takes a lot of energy. And we put in a lot of time preparing for this, getting ready, going through renewals like this. And I think it's really important that before we start training, we really understand why are we doing this. So let me tell you a little bit about my story and why I've decided to become an instructor and teach this program and dedicate my life to this content. And then I'm going to ask you for your story and for you to write it in your instructor guide. My background is in education before I came to CPI. I worked with at-risk students in Chicago and here in Milwaukee after school. So these were many kids who were having difficulty in the classroom, not performing well in the standard classroom setting, and they would come to me in the evening where I could work with them on a one-to-one basis to help build up their skills and eventually even get them back into classroom types of settings. Many of them had been in and out of schools. So obviously in this setting and working with these at-risk kids, I was dealing with a lot of challenging behaviors, aggressive behaviors, and crisis situations. And for the most part, I really thought I was doing a pretty good job, but I was learning as I went, and I was trying to figure things out as I went along. And I really felt like that wasn't always fair to those students that I was working with, for me just to kind of wing it and find things as I went along. So somewhere along the way, I came across the CPI content in the CPI program, and I said, wow, why didn't I have this earlier? Why didn't I have this when I first started working with these kids? How much more productive I could have been. And it was at that moment that I said, everybody should have this content and have this material. They shouldn't be out there trying to figure it out on their own. So that's when I looked to join CPI and made the commitment to say, I am going to be an instructor of this content. And that's something that I do remind myself of every time I go into a training. Every time I get ready and walk in front of a group, I really want to hold true to why am I doing this and make sure I understand that. So I'm just going to give you a minute or so here, and I'd like you to open up your instructor guide. And maybe on the front cover, I'd like you to write your story. Just write down a little bit why you do what you do. So go ahead, I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds or so to write some ideas down as to why you get up every day in front of your staff and train. All right, do you have some ideas down? I hope you do. I wanted you to write that in your instructor guide because I think it's important that every time you get ready to train and you open up that instructor guide, right there on the inside cover is some reasons why you're doing this. And it is important work that we're doing as instructors, and I think we need that reminder every now and then. So thank you for doing that little exercise. All right, let's jump in and look at each of the units of the program, starting with the crisis development model. And like I said, the crisis development model is our foundation. You've heard that before as you've come back through trainings, and you've probably even said it as well in your trainings. But what exactly does that mean that it's our foundation? Well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to start in 1980 when we, as a company, were developing this program and this content. And the basis for the crisis development model and why we created this model was to really slow down that chaotic crisis moment. What we were finding is that people had a lot of difficulty making sense of that chaotic moment. There were so many things happening in a crisis. What exactly was happening? You probably even see it today when you see things on incident reports like Sam went off or Alex exploded. These are people who are trying to explain a crisis situation. They're trying to find their words to tell you exactly what happened, but they don't quite have those words. They don't quite know how to make sense of all of that chaos that they just went through. So the crisis development model was really established to help people make sense and to slow that moment down. So we came up with 4 very manageable and distinct levels to say, here's the behaviors that an individual go through in a crisis. And alongside that, we came with 4 balanced and proportionate responses, that when you're seeing that behavior, here are some things that staff can do to help de-escalate that situation. So it was all about slowing that moment down and creating a foundational structure for people to better understand a crisis situation. But as a crisis, as a foundation, that program, or this crisis development model, really laid everything that we needed to do to create the program. So the rest of the units, the 9 other units in the program, all built off of and fit into this model. And this is what started that movement forward. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean. As we created this and we looked at supportive approaches, Units 2 and 3 really started to expand that supportive approach. We look at our nonverbal approaches and how we can be supportive. So we talk to staff and we really have discussions around how can we use personal space, body language, and touch to ultimately be supportive to someone's anxiety. And this may look something like where we move in and get close to someone and we gently touch their forearm to comfort them. Or it may look something like giving them some distance. It might be an individual who needs a little bit more room, so we give them distance. In both those situations, we're using the concepts in Unit 2 around personal space to be supportive to that individual. We did the same with Unit 3 in paraverbal communication. We looked at tone, volume, and cadence, and how can we use our voice to really provide support for that individual. So it's these strategies that we use to help communicate support in that crisis situation. So Units 2 and 3 are all extensions of that supportive model. We then built off of that and said, okay, as we move into the defensive and directive levels, let's have Units 4 and 5 represent those approaches. And this is where we created the verbal escalation continuum to expand on these defensive levels and to slow down and make sense of that chaotic moment of a defensive level. And then we focused on recognizing these behaviors and choosing appropriate strategies and interventions, such as limit setting, isolating the situation, or even listening empathically. This level can be difficult for individuals or for staff to understand why these behaviors occur and what are the needs of a person in crisis. So we also added in Unit 5 to focus on precipitating factors or causes of behavior, and also rational detachment to help us maintain control of our own behaviors at this level. So Units 4 and 5 expand on that defensive and directive approach. Units 6, 7, 8, and 9 all start to build out that risk behavior and physical intervention levels. We talk about how our fears and anxieties, which are obviously heightened at this risk behavior level, how those are heightened in this time. We look at risk objectively, and we have a decision-making matrix to help us look at risk objectively. We then focus on our decision-makings as staff and the decisions that we're making at this risk behavior level to make sure that we are choosing balanced and proportionate responses. And we weave that right into physical intervention of disengagement and holding by having a variety of skills or a range of interventions that we can use and making the decision as to what is the most balanced and proportionate response to that risk. And then finally, we wrap up at the program by looking at Unit 10 and expanding that tension reduction and therapeutic rapport level. This therapeutic rapport is important to maintain relationships, debrief the event, and we also at this level introduce the coping model as a tool to help staff to have those conversations. So ultimately, my point here is that all 10 units fit within the crisis development model. If our participants go through our course and they don't see that connection or they don't see that link, they might take certain things away or understand certain concepts, but they're not going to get the big picture or the whole. And I think that's where it's our role as instructors to really link all of this together so it's not seen as 10 separate units, but one program that's cohesively intertwined around the crisis development model. All right, so I want you to think for a moment about what along the way helped you to start to realize some of those connections. Maybe you're one of the lucky ones that caught that right away in your initial training. Maybe it was out as you were teaching, you started to see those connections around the crisis development model and the units that follow. Or maybe it was something when you came back to a renewal program, you started to see that connection. It does connect for people at different times. But I think it's important for us as instructors to look and say, what can we do as instructors to help our staff make those connections to the crisis development model so it's seen as one cohesive program? So what I'd like you to do is to take a moment and enter some ideas in your question and answer box that you have, and let us know so we can share some ideas with one another. What are some things that we can do to help our staff make those connections in our training? We are here moderating some of those questions and responses that come in, and then we'll share some of those with the group. So why don't we just take a break? I'm going to give you 30 seconds to enter in some of those responses, and then we will look at what's coming in and share some ideas with one another. All right. I'm actually already seeing some of these responses starting to come in.
Utilizing visuals or posters in the training room.
Utilizing visuals or posters within your programs. I think that's an excellent idea to help people make those connections. I know when I train, I always try to have the crisis development model up front somewhere on a poster or on a flip chart paper, so that way I can consistently refer back to that crisis development model to let people know where we are at and what level we are expanding. And I think that visual up front in the training room helps for people to make those connections. Excellent. Let's look at a couple others that are coming in.
A couple people mentioned role-playing, specific things that detail the different levels.
Okay, role-playing specific levels. Again, I think that is a great idea. That is one of those things that starts to add some relevancy to the crisis development model, so people can see that importance and how does it actually relate to them in their workplace environment. So I think role plays are an excellent way that we can create that connection as well. Excellent.
A lot of people mention examples or using concept maps.
Ooh, examples or concept maps. I love that idea of our examples as an instructor as a way for us to be able to make that material come alive and make those connections, I think is really important. And that's not easy. I think that's something we need to prepare for and plan for. I know I have my notes when I train, and it specifically has examples mapped out in there, so that way I can help those participants make those connections and really see how those different levels come alive. Excellent. Thank you for those ideas. Keep them coming in, and we will try to get those to you and discuss those more with your individual coach. But it allows us to see some of those good things that we're doing out there as instructors. All right, so let's dig a little bit deeper here and look a little more in depth with units 2 and 3 and how they start to expand those supportive approaches. So now that we've looked at the crisis development model, we see and talked about how the units fit into that structure. Let's look more specifically at how this works. Unit 2 and 3 really deal with communication. And to me, a crisis is all about communication. And maybe I should say a crisis is all about miscommunication or the inability to communicate. If we look at a person in crisis as a person in distress who is trying to express an emotion or a feeling or a need to us, which is oftentimes what's happening, then we can see that connection and that importance to communication. They may not always be expressing their need or their emotion in appropriate ways, and they may not even be expressing it verbally. It might be done through their actions or through their behaviors, but they are trying to communicate something to us as staff. And in return, as staff, we're trying to decipher through that message, and we're trying to respond back to them and communicate back to them in appropriate manners. And it's when that cycle is broken, when we're not effectively recognizing the need or what they're communicating, or we are not necessarily communicating effectively back to them, that's when we can see that crisis continue to grow. And that's why we begin our program talking about communication, because for us to be able to de-escalate a situation, we really as staff need to become communication experts. And that's again why we dedicate those first 2 units to discussing communication. People don't always think about communication in a crisis situation, but it's that key component that has the ability to either escalate or de-escalate. So that's where we look at nonverbal communication. We look at paraverbal communication, concepts like body language, personal space, touch. We look at tone, volume, and cadence, and we discuss all of those to help staff become those communication experts. All right, so again, we look at those 3 components, and I want you to think about the activities that we do in units 2 and 3. And how do these activities really help those in our class to understand the importance of communication in a crisis situation? And as you're thinking about that, again, I want you to learn from one another, and I want you to type into that question and answer box some things that you can do to help your staff see that communication more clearly and see the importance of communication more clearly. So again, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or so. Type in some ideas into that question box, and we're here going to be moderating some ways that you can help staff see the importance of communication in a crisis situation and why that's important to being supportive to an individual. All right, things are already starting to come in. You guys are great. Thank you for this. Let's look at a couple of the responses that are coming in.
Considering how to approach somebody before giving blood.
Oh, it's how to approach someone before drawing blood. I think that is a great discussion piece within your classes or with your staff, very relevant to that healthcare facility. I can just sense that person with anxiety that you have to test blood or draw blood. And how do you approach that person? And what are your nonverbals? What are your paraverbals? And how can you use that communication of what you're doing to be supportive to that person in what could be a very anxious moment for that individual?
A lot of people are saying examples, role plays, videos, scenarios.
Examples, role plays, scenarios, love the idea of videos. I've seen a lot of those incorporated into different trainings. Absolutely, I think all of those examples and the activities even that we have built into our program are all designed to help people practice and understand that importance of communication. So I love the idea of scenarios, role plays, and practicing those skills.
Adding in different environments that they'll be in, like louder environments or chaotic environments.
Oh, excellent. Adding in different environments. So once you've kind of talked about the basic concepts around communication, how do you adapt that if you're in a very loud environment? I'm thinking like a cafeteria at a school or cafeteria at a healthcare facility, and probably the other way around. What if you have a situation in a library or in a quiet area or a private area? You can start throwing in some different environmental factors that could determine that communication as well. All right, excellent. Keep those coming in. We can start to see some of those and again, learn from one another. But again, I'm hoping that you're seeing that connection to the crisis development model and how right away after we introduce that structure, we really focus on communication and the importance of communication within that crisis situation. All right, so now let's take a look at Units 4 and 5 and how these start to expand that defensive and directive level. It's really here at the defensive level that things can start to get chaotic for staff, and it can be difficult for them to really make sense of the behaviors that they're seeing, start to understand the needs of the individual or why an individual may be displaying these behaviors. And even it becomes more and more difficult to communicate effectively because it becomes louder, it becomes more emotional, more things are happening in those situations. So certainly don't lose focus of the communication skills that we talked about in Unit 2 and 3. We still need to be supportive and focus on those. But this is now things happening quickly, and the energy of the crisis is rising dramatically. So one of the things that we did was we developed the verbal escalation continuum to help slow down that moment. Much like the crisis development model back in 1980 when we said things are chaotic, we need to slow down an entire crisis, we also looked and said, you know what, the defensive level, we need to slow that down as well and help people to really understand what is happening at this level. And so we created the verbal escalation continuum that looks at 5 different behaviors or classifications of behaviors that you may start to see in that defensive level. It helps people to organize that thinking and again be able to put some words around what's happening. So instead of Alex went off, Alex was refusing or Alex was releasing. It just helps them to really organize their thinking around that defensive level. But oftentimes I think we can get caught into this verbal escalation continuum. It's a great model, don't get me wrong, I love this model, but it does focus on behaviors, and we can get a little lost as instructors because we start talking about it being a kite and how it bounces around or behaviors don't go in order. And we get distracted a little bit talking about behaviors where keep in mind the real power of this model is, yes, organizing our thinking and helping us understand behaviors, But it's actually more important than that because it's once we recognize the behavior, we have to choose appropriate interventions to go along with that. It's not about recognizing the behavior, it's about being able to intervene and de-escalate that crisis situation. And that's the real power of this model. And I think sometimes we lose that. And if you take a look at Unit 4 and Unit 5, I know this is very small print and you may not be able to see all this, but look at all of the strategies that are in Unit 4 and Unit 5 that focus on how staff can be successful in that directive approach and at that defensive level. So again, recognizing behaviors can only take us so far. As instructors, I think it's important that we keep the focus on those interventions, because if our staff leaves our training understanding the behaviors, but they don't know what to do when they see those behaviors, I think we failed them as instructors. Yes, we need to get them to see the importance of the behaviors, but we also need to teach them and help them understand what to do and how to intervene successfully at that directive level. And there's so many things that we're offering in those units to help them do that. So, as I said, the defensive level can be very difficult for people to understand. It's happening quickly, it's emotional, lots of things are going on. Because of that, we also wanted to focus on some of the needs in helping the staff to understand why certain behaviors are occurring at this level. And really get them to see the causes of behavior. So that's where we have incorporated that precipitating factors right after this unit. It is also a time when staff can get so caught into those behaviors they lose that rational detachment. They start to take things personally and they start to lose that concept of the integrated experience and our role in that. So we really wanted to bring that forward at this level as well. So that's where you'll notice we have that verbal escalation continuum to understand the concepts and the behaviors. We spend a lot of time talking about limit setting and interventions and listening, but then we follow that up right away by helping staff to understand why behaviors occur, how they can stay in control of their own behaviors, and ultimately create a positive integrated experience for a better outcome and better interaction. All right, so once again, I want you to think for a moment about why of all the interventions explored in Unit 4, and I just gave you a whole list of them, why is it that we specifically have an activity around limit setting, and why do we have our participants practice limit setting? Think about that for a moment, and then I'd like you to share some examples of how you've been able to effectively limit set, or even if we look at this from a trainer perspective, how you have helped your organization better understand this idea of limit setting. So again, I'm going to give you just about 30 seconds or so to type in some ideas in that question and answer box, and we'll share a couple of those responses. All right, let's look at those question and answers that are coming in.
It allows them to help, like they feel like they still have some control.
Oh, limit setting helps them feel the person in crisis or the person in distress still has some control. Absolutely. I think that's one of the keys to limit setting. It's not about forcing an individual to do a certain thing or forcing them to do what we want them to do. It's really about them understanding their choices and making decisions. And if we can do that in a way that maintains that integrity and respect and empowers them, even better. Excellent example.
Allow wait time for cool down or processing.
Allowing time for a cool down or wait time. Absolutely, I think that's another great strategy that, again, oftentimes we can get so caught in as staff that we need this behavior to stop now, we need this behavior to change immediately, that sometimes we forget that it takes a moment to get there. A person doesn't go from 60 to 0 just like that. They need to slow down. So sometimes giving them a cool down or giving them some time can really help and make that limit that you set more effective.
When and then.
when and then statements, an excellent strategy that we talk about in our program. You have if and then, when and then, first then. Those are all variations on limit setting that is again a nice way to keep the focus on what you need them to do or the outcome that you want, but also set some boundaries at the same time. All right, so again, we're kind of making our way through each of the units and talking about how they're incorporated into the crisis development model. So that brings us up to units 6, 7, 8, and 9, which is really around making some decisions. So we're really looking at that risk behavior and physical intervention levels. Risk behavior and decision making at the risk behavior level, it really becomes critical at this point. The behaviors are now starting to become risky, and our decision making is extremely, extremely important. Yet it's also at this moment when it is most important to make sound decisions that our decision making can sometimes leave us, and we don't always make the best decisions. And there's many reasons for that we explore in these units in 6 and 7. We talk about staff fear and anxiety starts to get in the way, and it can impact our decision making. We talk about our emotional brain being hijacking our rational brain, and all of a sudden our emotions as staff take over and we're not thinking clearly, and it's if our rational brain has been hijacked by our emotions. We bring back in this idea of rational detachment and the importance of staying in control of our own behaviors, but that can sometimes leave us as well, and we start to take things personally. So it's at this moment when we need sound decisions the most that we're all of a sudden susceptible to unproductive responses. Unit 6 through 9 are all about helping us to remain rational and choosing proportionate responses to that risk behavior. The decision-making matrix is designed to help assess risk objectively. No, it's not designed for a person to pull out this poster or their workbook right in the middle of a crisis to help make decisions, but it's a way that we can help staff to understand what's going on and make some objective decisions. And the more we discuss it and the more we talk about it, the easier it is for staff when they're in that moment. So this is one of those that I see as consistently reinforced through staff meetings, or where staff will get together and plot recent situations. I've even seen the decision-making matrix put on incident reports and debriefing sheets to continually bring that idea of decision-making back to those crisis situations. So I want you to think a moment about the decision-making matrix specifically and how this tool can help your staff. And I'm going to ask you again to share with the group in your question box how you and your staff use the decision-making matrix to help improve that decision-making in that risk behavior level. So let's take a moment, type in some responses into that question and answer. Really anxious for this one to hear how you're using the decision-making matrix to help staff. All right, I see a few responses trickling in.
Creating behavior plans.
Creating behavior plans. Excellent. Love that idea that if I'm going to effectively create a behavior plan for this individual, I first need to objectively understand the risk of the behavior that we're seeing. If I'm going to choose an appropriate intervention, I need to be able to understand that risk. And a good behavior plan, it matches directly to that level of risk. Excellent. I love that idea.
Using it during debriefing times.
Using it during debriefing times, another excellent one, is again, often people can get locked into, oh, I need to use the decision making in the moment. Well, sometimes it's afterwards to review our decisions and say, did we assess risk appropriately? Did we make the appropriate decisions? And did we choose balanced and proportionate responses? And getting staff together after an incident to be able to talk about and use that decision making matrix is an excellent way to continue to grow better decisions in crisis.
Helps us to add objectivity.
Helps us to add objectivity, absolutely. We started Unit 6 and 7 by talking about all of these things that get in our way of making good decisions. Things like our fears, our anxieties, taking things personally, which can often be those subjective types of things. We really look and say, how can we take those things out and objectively look at the behavior or the risk and plot it on the decision-making matrix to help make some appropriate decisions.
Helps visually show staff how behaviors can vary significantly, not one size fits all.
Yep. Again, it's a nice visual approach, and it certainly can be used that not all behaviors are the same. And we're certainly going to talk about this a little bit as we get into more of the physical interventions that are coming up. But not all behaviors are the same, and they not all share the same risk. Not all right punches are the same. Not all have the same risk. Not all refusal has the same risk. So sometimes you can take the same behavior and look at it in different levels and plot it on the decision-making matrix. So again, sound decision-making is crucial for deciding the when and how to use physical interventions. And that then leads us into the physical portions of the program around disengagement and holding if you are teaching those parts of the program. So as we look at disengagement and holding, CPI's physicals are principle-based. That's something that you have probably heard before, but sometimes what does that mean as an instructor, that the physicals are principle-based? So I wanted to put up a couple definitions to help us better understand the difference between principle-based learning and technique-based learning. So a principle is defined as a fundamental truth that serves as a foundation. It's something that's true all the time, all across the board, where a technique is a specific way to carry out a task. So it has one specific purpose to it. Now, what does that mean for us and what does that look like? I will tell you, staff will often come to you as a trainer and they want techniques. Just tell me how to do something so I don't get in trouble. Show me what to do so I don't hurt someone else, right? And I can see where that's coming from and why people do want the safety of that technique. It does help with some of those fears and anxieties. But at the same time, a technique can be limiting and it can actually start to overwhelm the learning process. So as an example, if we think about the wrist grab, which we're going to demonstrate here in a moment, if we look at a wrist grab and we talk about it as a technique, let me show you how to get out of this one specific wrist grab. That may work, but then all of a sudden they may ask and say, well, what if they grab me this way? What if they grab on top? What if they grab with two hands? What if they grab higher on the arm? And all of a sudden, that particular task, we're now down this rabbit hole and trying to accomplish 5 different tasks. And we as trainers have to now provide all of these different techniques, and that can get very overwhelming for us as staff and for the learner. It becomes very difficult for a learner to remember and practice all of these different techniques. So principle learning is much more effective because it gives guidance and it can be applied across a variety of grabs. So instead of talking about 10 different wrist grabs and 10 different techniques to get out of those wrist grabs, we give a set of principles that are true and sound all the way through those 10 grabs. So if a staff member remembers those principles, it will help them through all of them, and it's a much easier way to learn the physical components of the program. So don't get caught into the teaching of techniques. It's very easy to do, but keep in mind that it's really not doing you or your participants any favors if you get caught into that rabbit hole of teaching techniques. Keep things principle-based. So what I want to do is look at what do we mean by training from a principle-based, and what exactly might that look like to keep the focus on the principles and not on the teaching tips and the techniques. So as we look at disengagements, let's start with, well, what are our principles? What are the principles that we keep solid and hold true through all of the grabs? It is really around this idea of position, posture, and proximity. Position is making sure that we're off to the side and in a safe place. Our posture is making sure that we are balanced as staff members and can move and adjust quickly. And our proximity is about how close or how far we are to that individual so we can manage that space and manage that safety between us. Once we have the position, posture, and proximity, we look to hold and stabilize to limit that range of motion. And you'll keep in mind here, we are not stopping movement or motion, we're just limiting that. We may look at using a pull-push or movement in opposite directions, or we may look at leverage, which is rotation around a fixed point. So again, these are the principles that we're going to look at through a variety of different grabs that stay true to all of these different situations. Okay. So the way we're going to approach this is to look at a classroom model video. And again, the classroom models are specific ways that have been designed to help people understand and see the principles. They're not necessarily designed to be reality. They're not the only way a person is going to be grabbed, but they are a way for people to be able to best see and learn the principles. And that's going to be important before we expand or do any kinds of problem solving types of things with them. So we're going to watch a series of videos around the classroom models, and then Stephen and Christina and I will look at demonstrating that, so that way you can see it kind of from a video perspective, but also from a live perspective of how we then teach utilizing those principles. And then we will stop and we will look at some considerations for facilitation from there. All right. So why don't we just jump right in, and why don't we start by looking at our first video, which is around the strike block.
Okay, so I'm going to adopt the supportive stance. My position is to the side, my posture is balanced and stable, and my proximity, I'm going to manage that space. Strike, I block and move to a place of safety.
All right, perfect. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring Stephen up here, and you saw a video, and now I'm going to look to demonstrate it more in a live perspective. So looking at the strike block, our principles here are going to be to block and move. It's a natural instinct. So I am going to look first to get into my supportive stance by my position being off to the side, my posture being balanced, and I'm considering proximity by managing the space. In a moment, Stephen is going to take a right punch, and I'm going to look to block and move out of the way. Stephen? I'm going to block and move out of the way. All right, good. So you've seen the video, and now you've been able to see Stephen and I demonstrate. So let's look at some considerations around, as a trainer, when you're teaching the strike, what are some things that you will want to keep in mind? So one of the first things that you will notice in both the video and both what Stephen and I did is that we demonstrated as staff. That I do think it's important to create a visual for your participants. We could certainly teach this from where we do the strike, but one of the things that we're finding as we consistently revise the classroom model is that it's important for our participants to have a demonstration. So you want to look at demonstrating as the staff member. You will also notice that the target was the shoulder when practicing. This is another one that we're slightly making some adjustments on. You may have heard instructors previously talk about aiming towards the nose for realism or things like that. But what we found is that participants have a difficult time with that, and it's not always a realistic practice. So we are finding that if you have the participant reach out and touch your shoulder or touch the staff member's shoulder, that creates a little bit more realism about that blocking and moving. And I also do want to remind you that blocking and moving is a natural protective response. So don't get too caught into, again, that technique of how a person is blocking or which way they're blocking, what hands they're blocking with. There certainly might be some adaptations that you need to help with or some corrections that you need to help with, but there's really no right way or wrong way of blocking. And again, we're looking at staff who may be looking to utilize this on an occasional basis, and it's best to tap into whatever their natural protective response might be. All right, let's start looking at the same thing. Now our principles are going to change slightly. This is where we look at the hold and stabilize, pull, push, and lever, because we're looking at the grabs and a person now has a hold of us. But let's look at how the hold and stabilize looks for a wrist grab.
So I'm going to start from my supportive stance, be positioned to the side, my posture is balanced. I'm going to consider my proximity and manage my space and hold and stabilize.
All right, I'm going to have Stephen come up so that we can demonstrate. All right, one of the things I want to think about is getting into my supportive stance. So my position is to the side, my posture is balanced, and again, I'm managing and considering that proximity by managing the space. And I'm going to look to hold and stabilize that grab. Hold and stabilize. All right, let's take a look at some considerations when you're teaching the physical component of the wrist grab of the hold and stabilize. So some of the things that you want to keep in mind is to really simplify the description of the classroom model. You may have noticed that in many of these examples to say that it's really just down to the principles and reiterating those principles over and over again. You may have some teaching tips or things that you want to put in. My recommendation would be to put those after the classroom model. Keep the classroom model focused on the principles, allow people to learn the principles, and if you need to give any teaching tips or any things after that, just keep it outside of the classroom model. Classroom models are focused on the principle. Think about to help reinforce behavior to adjust the supportive stance. You'll notice that in the videos and in the demonstration, we started from more of a straight-on position and then made an adjustment to get into our supportive stance. Now again, no, this isn't always reality and you're not always going to have to adjust, but it does show that and reinforce that supportive stance and that position, posture, proximity. So if you're consistently coming back to that, it helps to reinforce the learning. You might want to think about holding and stabilizing with a natural grip. In both of these videos, it was a natural grip with the thumb on top. You will often see some people grab in different ways. And just use a natural grip to hold and stabilize. And just a reminder for your staff that they are holding and stabilizing something. There is a level of aggression here, even if it is a little bit lower, there is a level of risk that we need to be aware of. And all we're looking to do is to hold and stabilize and slow down that movement. So do make sure they're not just tapping or prompting, that they are actually holding and stabilizing. That's important at this stage. All right, as with the level of risk continues to increase, we need to look at, again, a range of interventions. So we start with the hold and stabilize, and then we look at the pull, push, or movement in opposite directions.
As I get into my supportive stance, I'm adjusting my position more to the side. My posture is balanced, and I'm considering proximity, managing the space. I'm going to hold and stabilize. I'm going to utilize pull, push, moving in opposite directions.
All right, I'm going to bring Stephen back up here for our demonstration. So once again, I want to start by thinking about my supportive stance and adjusting my position to the side, my posture where I'm balanced in proximity to manage the space. I'm going to be looking to hold and stabilize and then use pull, push, or movement in opposite directions. All right, let's look at some of those considerations that we have. Once again, you will notice that we look to adjust the supportive stance. Again, if people are already in their supportive stance, great, but from a learning perspective, I think it's continual learning to reinforce the adjustment of your position, posture, and proximity, and that it's not a stationary spot. We did hold and stabilize because it's a natural reaction. That's probably going to be a person's first movement, and it does continue to layer on the learning. So we did hold and stabilize, And then we look to pull and push or movement in opposite directions. So an important consideration here is that it is pulling and pushing or movement in opposite directions in conjunction with one another. One alone is not necessarily going to be successful. If Stephen were to grab me and I just tried to pull away, if he's stronger than I, that wouldn't work. If all I tried to do was to push his arm away and he was stronger than I was, it wouldn't work. It's utilizing the pull and the push at the same time and in conjunction with one another that gives you the advantage of that principle. All right, again, we're looking at varying levels of intervention depending on the risk. So we've looked at the hold and stabilize, we've looked at the pull push, so now let's look at leverage.
So I'm going to get into a supportive stance, position to the side, posture balanced, and consider my proximity and manage the space. I'm going to hold and stabilise and then utilise a lever, which is movement around a fixed point.
All right, so once again, we're going to come back and watch Stephen and I with this one. Once again, I want to think about my supportive stance. My position becomes off to the side. My posture is balanced, and I'm considering and managing proximity in the space. I am going to look at holding and stabilizing, and I'm going to use leverage, which is movement around a fixed point. All right, let's look at some of the considerations or some of the things that we were doing. Once again, you will notice that we did the adjusting the supportive stance. We are continually reinforcing that hold and stabilizing by coming back to that over and over again. And then we did introduce the idea of leverage, which is movement around a fixed point. In this situation, the weak point in Stephen's grab was the thumb. And by moving around that fixed point, by holding and stabilizing and moving around that fixed point, I was able to gain the leverage to disengage and move out of the way. So you're always looking about that movement around a fixed point. All right, so we looked at the wrist grab as a way to incorporate all of these principles from a low hold and stabilize, medium pull push, and a higher level of leverage. Now let's look at how these principles apply again across a variety of different holds or different grabs. You will notice the principle stays the same, and we utilize those principles through a variety of different grabs. So this is going to be the clothing grab, focusing on the principles, and we're going to look at hold and stabilize, pull, push, and lever all together.
I'm going to get into a supportive stance. My position is to the side, my posture is balanced, and I want to consider our proximity and manage the space as I hold and stabilize.
Getting into my supportive stance, I'm considering my position to the side, my posture is balanced, I'm going to consider my proximity and manage the space. First thing I'm going to do is hold and stabilize, and then I'm going to use I pull, push, moving in the opposite direction.
First, I'm going to get into my supportive stance. Position is off to the side, posture is balanced, and I'm considering proximity to manage the space. I'm going to then hold and stabilize and use a lever moving around a fixed point to disengage.
All right, why don't we come back for the demonstration? So again, Stephen and I will look at the clothing grab, hold and stabilize, pull, push, and leverage. So Stephen, if you wanted to grab. So I'm going to look to get into my supportive stance, adjusting my position to be to the side. My posture is balanced. I'm managing and considering proximity in the space. And I am going to look to hold and stabilize that grab. Hold and stabilize. If I'm looking at a little bit higher intensity and I need to choose a balanced and proportionate response, it might be the pull-push. So again, I'm going to look to adjust my supportive stance, my position, posture, and proximity. I am going to look to hold and stabilize, and I'm going to use a pull-push or movement in opposite directions. And if the intensity of the behavior or the risk of the behavior continues to grow, I'm going to again choose a balanced and proportionate response around utilizing leverage. So I'm going to again consider my supportive stance. I'm going to look to hold and stabilize, and I'm going to gain leverage, which is rotation around that fixed point. So again, you can see these principles are staying the same over and over again. So let's look at some considerations around the clothing grab and teaching of the clothing grab. So one of the things that you want to think about as an instructor is allowing participants to choose where on their clothing that they would like to practice. You saw in the videos and you saw in the practice of Stephen and I that we did kind of choose higher up on the shoulder area. That tends to be the easiest for people to see and to practice, but not everyone is always comfortable with their clothing being grabbed there. So the principles do apply to different places, so you may want to allow people to choose where they feel comfortable having their clothing grabbed for practice. Again, you want to look to hold and stabilize with a natural grip. And when you're looking at utilizing leverage, it's not always necessarily to switch hand positions. Oftentimes you will see the staff placing their hand on the back palm of the individual. That is certainly that's an adjustment that you can make, but it's not necessarily something they have to do. And just keep in mind, if you do teach the back of the palm, it is teaching staff to hold and stabilize in two different ways. So you might just want to think about keeping that hold and stabilizing with a natural grip and kind of in a natural position before you add on the complexity of other hand positions. All right, you're kind of getting the feel for this of how these principles can come out through your teaching. So let's look at how this applies to a hair grab.
So I'm going to get into my supportive stance. I'm going to be positioned to the side. My posture is going to be balanced. I'm going to manage my space considering the proximity, and I'm going to hold and stabilize.
As I get into my supportive stance, my position is to the side, my posture is balanced. I am also considering proximity and managing the space. I want to hold and stabilize. Then I'm going to utilize a full push, moving in opposite directions.
So I'm going to get into a supportive stance, position onto the side, posture I'm balanced, I'm considering my proximity and managing the space. I'm going to hold and stabilise and then use a lever, which is movement around a fixed point.
All right, let's have Stephen come on up and we will demonstrate the hair grab principles before we talk about some considerations. So once again, I want to think about getting into my supportive stance, adjusting my position to the side, my posture is balanced. I'm considering proximity and managing the space, and I'm going to want to look to hold and stabilize that grab to limit the range of motion. Hold and stabilize to limit the range of motion. All right. If it's a little bit higher intensity, I'm still going to keep my principles of adjusting my supportive stance. I'm going to look to hold and stabilize, and I'm going to use a pull push opposite directions to move out of the way into safety. And then the last one, if the intensity continues to grow and the risk continues to grow, we're going to choose a balanced and proportionate response around leverage. So again, I'm getting into my supportive stance, my position, posture, and proximity. I'm going to hold and stabilize, and I'm going to utilize leverage to rotate through that fixed point and move to safety. All right, now that you've seen a couple demonstrations, let's talk about these considerations or things to think about when you're teaching the hair grab release. Once again, you may want to allow participants to choose how they want to practice. There can be some fears around the hair grab, so you can either practice by having people actually take a hold of their hair, or if people are not comfortable, that you could have them put their fist on the top of their head, and it simulates the same concept for practice. The leverage is very similar to the clothing grab. So if they are able to get the clothing grab, the hair is pretty much the same type of movement and same concept. And again, you want to keep your teaching tips outside of the classroom model. It seems to be here at the hair that I start to see a lot of teaching tips start to come in. One that I personally use is this idea of to gain leverage, you want to tuck your chin. I've heard step towards the pocket. There's different teaching tips that you can utilize around this. I'm just going to encourage you, those types of things are perfectly fine, and I don't want anybody taking away my tuck the chin teaching tip that I use. I'm just going to encourage you to use it outside of the classroom model, so that way you keep the classroom model focused on the principles, and then any of your teaching tips or things that you do become outside of that classroom model. All right, let's look at how these apply for a neck or shoulder grab.
I want to get into a supportive stance. My position is to the side, my posture is balanced, and I want to consider the proximity and manage the space as I hold and stabilize.
I'm moving into a supportive stance. I'm going to leave my positions to the side. My posture is balanced. I'm going to consider my proximity and manage the space. First thing I'm going to do is hold and stabilize and use a pull push, moving in opposite directions.
First, I want to get into a supportive stance. My position is off to the side, posture is balanced, and I'm considering proximity to manage the space. I then want to hold and stabilize and use a lever movement around a fixed point to disengage.
All right, if we look at the shoulder or neck grab, once again, I want to think about getting into my supportive stance, adjusting my position to the side. My posture is balanced. I'm considering proximity by managing the space. And I want to look to hold and stabilize to limit that range of motion. All right. If the intensity is a little bit higher, I need to look at a pull push. So once again, I'm going to think about getting into my supportive stance with my position, posture, and proximity. I'm going to look to hold and stabilize, and I'm going to do a pull push movement in opposite directions. And finally, if that risk is continuing to grow, I may need to utilize a balanced proportionate response around leverage. So I'm once again going to get into my supportive stance, my position, posture, and proximity. I'm going to hold and stabilize, and I'm going to look to utilize lever or rotate or movement around a fixed point. All right, now that you've seen a couple demonstrations, let's talk about a few considerations around the neck or shoulder grab. Once again, I think this is a place where you can allow for some choices for the participants' comfort. You'll notice that I was referring to it as a neck or a shoulder grab. People don't always feel comfortable around the neck. Sometimes it's a little bit easier if you place the hands on the shoulders, and it is the same type of concept and the same practice. I would also look to refrain from calling it a choke, because oftentimes a choke will signal a certain intent behind what's happening. And people will often say there is no low level or medium level choke. So it's often just, it's where the grab is being at, which is oftentimes the neck or the shoulder. You will also notice that in both demonstrations, we looked at using one arm to rotate and gain leverage around that fixed point. You can certainly use two arms if you've been trained in that way. Just keep in mind that the leverage and movement is really just happening at one place, and one arm is doing the movement around a fixed point, the other arm is not. The benefit of using both arms is that you don't have to think about which way you're rotating or which way you're moving. So you could use one arm up or two arms, whichever one you're more comfortable with. All right, let's take a look at how these principles play out for a body grab.
So I'm going to get into a supportive stance, position myself to the side, my posture is balanced, and considering proximity, I'm going to manage my space, and I'm going to hold and stabilize.
As I get into my supportive stance, I'm positioning my body more to the side. My posture is balanced. I'm also going to consider my proximity and manage the space. I'm going to hold and stabilize, and then I will utilize a pull-push, moving in opposite directions.
I'm going to get into a supportive stance, position, I'm off to the side, posture, I'm balanced, I'm considering my proximity and managing the space. I'm going to hold and stabilise, and then using a lever, movement around a fixed point.
All right, why don't we bring it back and look at a demonstration from Stephen and I. A low-level body grab. Again, I want to think about getting into my supportive stance and adjusting my position to the side. My posture is balanced, and I'm considering proximity and managing space as best I can. And I am going to look to hold and stabilize that grab. Hold and stabilize. All right. If the risk of the behavior continues to grow, I may need to increase my intervention, which is going to be to look to do a pull push. So once again, I am going to think about getting into a supportive stance. I am off to the side, I am balanced, and I'm considering my proximity. And I'm going to look to use a pull push by moving his arm and my body in opposite directions. And finally, a leverage if my arms are trapped. I again want to think about my position, posture, and proximity to get into my supportive stance. I'm going to want to think about holding and stabilizing as best I can to limit that range of motion. And I want to look to use leverage, rotation around a fixed point. All right, so now that you've seen a couple demonstrations, let's take a look at some considerations around teaching the body grabs. Think about holding and stabilizing on the top arm. Whichever way the person grabs you, there's typically one hand on top and one hand underneath. There are typically advantages or disadvantages to both, but oftentimes when we're utilizing the principles that we're teaching in this program, if you can move the hand that's on top, that can tend to be a little bit more effective. So you'll notice in all of the demonstrations we were focusing on holding and stabilizing and moving the hands on the top arm. And again, with the pull push, you want to this time think about moving their hand and your body in opposite directions. Move their hand and your body in opposite directions. All right, last grab that we want to take a look at is the bite release. So let's take a look at the videos here for that.
I want to get into a supportive stance. My position is off to the side. My posture is balanced. I'm managing the proximity or the space, and I hold and stabilize.
I'm going to get into a supportive stance. My position is to the side. My posture is balanced. I'm going to consider my proximity and manage the space. First thing I'm going to do is hold and stabilize. And we're going to say pull, push, move in opposite direction, adjusting my supportive stance.
All right, let me bring in Stephen to demonstrate this one. So once again, the first thing I'm going to look to do is to make sure that I am in my supportive stance where my position is to the side. My posture is balanced and I'm managing proximity and space as best I can. And I'm going to look to hold and stabilize to be able to limit that range of motion. Hold and stabilize. All right. If the intensity is a little bit higher, again, I'm thinking about my position, posture, and proximity, that supportive stance. I'm going to hold and stabilize and look at bringing that person, pulling that person closer to me and pushing my body close to limit that range of motion and getting into my supportive stance. All right, let's talk about some of the considerations because I know the bite release, teaching this one can be a little bit challenging. One of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do is, again, stay focused on the principles with your teaching, but you can practice this one slowly. There's often this perception that for any of these principles to work, I need to move quickly and I need to move fast for it to be effective. That's not always the case, and especially not with the bite release. And in fact, sometimes the faster you move or the quicker you move, the more risky it can become. So think about just practicing slowly. You do not need to go quick or fast with this one. So those are some strategies that you can see around the disengagement skills, and hopefully you're seeing at this point how we have been focused on the principles of position, posture, proximity, looking to hold and stabilize, pull, push, and utilizing leverage. As you move into the holding portion of the program, this really stays exactly the same. It is a principle-based. Your principles just change slightly. You're still considering your position off to the side, your posture balanced, your proximity is managing space. But now our principles become outside, inside, having something on the outside and something on the inside. Something on the outside often is something that protects us. Something on the inside protects the individual or our fellow staff member. And again, this is an important one that we're going to look to limit the range of motion. Oftentimes people think with holding that we need to stop movement or prevent movement, that can actually be detrimental and become harmful. We are looking to slow movement or limit that range of aggressive motion, not trying to stop movement in these holding situations. All right, so once again, we're going to look at seated. We're going to look at the low, the medium, and the high, and then I'm going to bring Stephen and Christina in to help me demonstrate these. All right, let's take a look at this video.
So I've adopted my supportive stance, my position is to the side, my posture is balanced and stable, and I'm managing the space with my proximity. I place something on the outside, something on the inside to limit the range of motion.
All right, so just as you saw there with Zoe, you want to think about, again, your supportive stance and being in a position to the side. Our posture is balanced, and we're considering that proximity to manage the space. And we are going to look to put something on the outside and something on the inside. All right, so let's look at some of the considerations around teaching the low level that you saw. So again, you'll want to see that we were beginning the classroom model demonstrated in a seat and seated in a chair. There's a lot of complexity around entering in or entry into a hold, so feel free to be able to start right in a seated position. And seated is often the easiest for people to learn. It's the most comfortable for them to learn, and it also minimizes things like size and strength and taller and smaller and shorter. So it minimizes a lot of those kinds of things and makes it easier for people to learn. Please note the staff member's arms, that it was at or above the elbow with their hand draped across the forearm or wrist, especially at this low level to limit the range of motion. You're not even necessarily always looking to grab or hold that individual. Sometimes it's just draping it across to be able to limit that range of motion. All right, if that intensity of that behavior increases and we need to choose a balanced and proportionate response, we're going to look at seated holding medium.
So I'm going to maintain my supportive stance. I'm going to stay positioned to the side. My posture will remain balanced. I'm going to consider my proximity by managing the space. I'm going to place something on the outside and something on the inside to limit the range of motion.
All right, so as the level of intensity increases, we may need to match that with our intervention. So once again, Christina and I are thinking about our position, which is off to the side. Our posture is balanced and relaxed, and we are considering proximity by managing the space. We are going to look to put something on the outside, something on the inside. All right, let's take a look at some of those considerations. So once again, you could see that we started from a seated position and we started in low to move into that medium level. Once again, the arm placement as we went into the medium level was at or above the elbow in a natural position. Think of kind of holding a cup. And our proximity was managing that proximity through the shoulders, the hips, and the legs. You will notice that there was close proximity all the way up and down the body to be able to limit that range of motion. So it's upper body and lower body that we were managing that proximity. All right, now let's look at transitioning from medium seated holding into that high holding.
I'm going to maintain my supportive stance with my position off to the side. My posture is well balanced, and I'm going to manage the proximity or the space. We'll place something on the outside and something on the inside to limit that range of motion.
All right, so once again, we are looking at the intensity of the behavior increasing. So we are going to need to move to a high. We are thinking about our supportive stance. Our position is to the side. Our posture is balanced. And we are considering proximity and managing the space. And we are going to look to put something on the outside and something on the inside to limit that range of motion. All right, let's talk about some of those teaching considerations. So once again, you will notice that we started from a seated holding and we had moved into the medium level. With the arm placement, to be able to bring in that outside-inside principle, we were securing at the wrist area, keeping that wrist in a midline position. This is really just a fancy way of saying we were keeping that wrist straight. We were not hyperextending or bending the wrist in any way. We were actually securing at the wrist in order to keep that wrist in a midline position. And we were bringing the arms high and back by the armpits to be able to take away the bicep. By bringing those arms up, we reduce that bicep, which is the largest muscle in the arm, and reduces the strength of that individual. And once again, you will notice in the video and in our demonstration that we manage proximity all throughout, up and down the body, through the shoulders, the hips, and the legs. All right, so you looked at it from a seated position. So the same principles apply now whether you're seated or whether you're standing. So let's look at these from a standing holding perspective.
All right, I'm going to use my supportive stance. My position is to the side. My posture is balanced. And I'm going to consider my proximity by managing the space. Something is going to be on the outside. Something is going to be the inside, which is the person. This is to limit the range of motion.
So I'm going to maintain my supportive stance, position onto the side, posture I'm balanced, and considering my proximity and managing the space, something on the outside, something on the inside to limit the range of motion. So I'm maintaining my supportive stance, position onto the side, posture I'm balanced, I'm considering my proximity and managing the space, something on the outside, something on the inside to limit the range of motion.
All right, you saw the video demonstration, so now let's bring it back and we will look at how you might teach that in more of a live perspective here. So once again, I'm thinking about a low level hold. I'm going to want to keep in mind my position is to the side, my posture is balanced, I'm considering that proximity and managing space. I have something on the outside and I have something on the inside in order to limit the range of motion. All right, Stephen, if you would come in and take up the low level, and we'll talk about transitioning to a medium level. In this, again, I'm going to think about my position and coming in from the side. My posture is balanced. I'm considering that proximity. I'm putting something on the outside, something on the inside to limit that range of motion. And if the intensity of the behavior continues to increase, our principles stay the same as we transition into a higher level hold. We have our position, posture, proximity in place. We're going to look to bring something on the outside, something on the inside to limit that range of motion. All right, let's look at some of those considerations. So as you look to teach the standing holding, you can do this from a stationary or a moving position. I would have loved to have been able to demonstrate moving today, but we're a little limited in our CPI studio. But keep in mind that you may demonstrate this. It's not just a stationary position. You can move with the person in this time period. And also notice the close body contact. Again, we were looking shoulders, hips, legs, all the way down. We are maintaining that close body contact, whether it's a stationary or moving position. All right, next one that we're going to take a look at, and again, focusing on those principles and how they apply to all of these holds, we're going to look at the team control position.
As we transition into a higher level of restriction, we maintain our supportive stance. Our position is to the side, our posture is balanced, and we manage the proximity or the space. Something is on the outside, something is on the inside, limiting the range of motion.
All right, let's bring it back so you can see us demonstrate. Steve? All right. You'll notice that we've made some adjustments to our supportive stance. Our position is to the side of the individual, our posture is balanced, and we are considering that proximity and managing space. We have something on the outside, we have something on the inside to limit the range of motion. All right. Once again, the team control can be a little bit more tricky to teach, so let's talk about some of the considerations here to think about when you're teaching. One of the things you notice in the video and that Stephen and Christina and I did is we did start from standing, holding, medium. That tends to be the easiest place to start from. There's a little more complexity if you start from a high level. Not that you can't go to a team control from a high level, you certainly may find yourself doing that, but there's a little bit more complexity to it. So from a classroom model to help people feel comfortable with it and understand the principles, we do recommend starting from a standing medium. And with the team control, you did notice that we were doing things to reduce the upper body and the lower body and mobility. So with the upper body, we had something on the outside and something on the inside, but we were also bringing the arms above the shoulders. This allowed to reduce that upper body strength. It's almost like painting the ceiling. Your arms start to get tired as the blood flows away from the arms. It's the same kind of concept here. Arms above the shoulders help to reduce that upper body strength, and we were anchoring it to the hip or waist area for us to be able to maintain that outside principle. We were also reducing lower body and mobility by keeping Christina's shoulders below her waist. When your shoulders are below your waist, that reduces that lower body strength. All right, let's continue this principle-based teaching as we move into the children's control position.
All right, I'm going to use my supportive stance. My position is to the side. My posture is balanced. And I'm going to consider my proximity by managing the space. Something is going to be on the outside. Something is going to be the inside, which is the person. This is to limit the range of motion.
To move to a medium restriction, I want to maintain my supportive stance. My position is off to the side. My posture is well balanced. I want to consider proximity and manage the space. As I step behind the child, bring something on the outside and something on the inside, and limit the range of motion. To move into a higher level of restriction, as I step behind the child, I want to maintain my supportive stance. My position is off to the side, my posture is balanced, and I'm considering my proximity and managing the space. Something on the outside, something on the inside, as I limit that range of motion.
So if we look again at a low-level children's control, I am thinking about my supportive stance, my position is to the side, my posture is balanced, and I'm considering proximity as I manage the space. I have something on the outside and something on the inside to limit the range of motion. If the intensity of the behavior grows and the risk grows, I may need to look at moving to a medium-level children's control position, but my principles stay the same. I'm just going to be able to change my position off to the side. My posture, again, is balanced, and my proximity is managing the space with close body contact. I'm going to put something on the outside and something on the inside to limit that range of motion. It is the same series of principles if I look to a high-level children's control position. I'm just going to adjust my position, make sure I'm to the side, my posture is balanced, and I'm considering proximity as I manage the space. I'm going to look to put something on the outside and something on the inside to limit the range of motion. Thank you, Christina. All right, let's take a look at some of our considerations around the children's control position. A couple of the things that you want to make sure are in place as an instructor is that we want to have and make sure those arms are placed high on the chest. This makes sure that we are not preventing breathing. If they slide too far down onto the stomach area, there is that chance of restricting breathing, so keep it high on the chest. And make sure those elbows are locked, one underneath the other. This prevents the individual from slipping through, but it also takes the pressure off of the shoulders and protects injury to the shoulders. So arms high on the chest, elbows locked under one another. All right, so hopefully you saw now as we walk through the disengagement and the holding, how our principles held up all the way through. And hopefully you're also seeing the importance of principle-based learning versus that technique learning. And again, just to reiterate, that technique is one specific pathway, where a principles are a series of truths that lead all the way through all of the holds or all of the disengagements. And that's why we feel comfortable teaching from a principle-based learning. All right. If you have any questions about the physicals or about principle or technique-based learning, keep in mind you do have that one-to-one consultation coming up with your global instructor, and they can certainly answer any questions that you may have around those areas. All right, I'd like to wrap things up today by taking a look at Unit 10, or the post-crisis. And just keeping with our theme today of our structure of a crisis development model, Unit 10 is an expansion of tension reduction and therapeutic rapport. This can often be a challenging level for staff for various reasons, including time to be able to get this in. And it is the exact same for us as instructors. Oftentimes we're busy throughout the training, we're running behind with our schedule, we're cut back with time, and we end up shortchanging this last section, the tension reduction and therapeutic rapport. But keep in mind that good postvention leads to good prevention. And this is what brings the crisis development model full circle. And tension reduction and supportive approaches, the therapeutic rapport and supportive approaches, are often similar because it becomes a cycle that ties everything together. So at this level, we do spend some time looking at the coping model, much like the crisis development model itself, or the verbal escalation continuum, the decision-making matrix. The coping model is a framework that helps us slow down that tension reduction therapeutic area and make sense of the conversations and those restorative conversations that we have to have with an individual at this stage. So as you think about some of these components to the coping model, we're going to watch a video, and we're going to actually watch two videos where a staff member is going through a debriefing process and looking to establish a relationship with an individual in his care. And I want you to watch this next video and really think about where are places in this video that the staff member might be damaging the relationship or minimizing the debriefing process. So where's the individual damaging the relationship or minimizing the debriefing process?
So, Alfie, I need you to tell me exactly what happened in class. So remember, I was there, so obviously I do know what happened, but you need to state, apparently, what happened.
Oh, well, you put me in a seat that I didn't like, sir.
Okay, look,
And
we've been over this time and time again. I choose to put you in seats because I'm putting you next to people who I know are less likely to distract you. Okay, so listen, there's a methodology here. Okay,
But I can't
with those seating. We've had this. This is not the issue. You know that you're meant to sit in those seats, and you decided not to. Okay, that's what happened. What else happened? In your words.
All right. So again, I asked you to look for some areas where maybe damaging the relationship or minimizing the debriefing process. I'd like to hear from you and once again learn from one another. So take a moment in your question and answer box to just type some of your responses there of your reaction to the staff member, some of the things that you saw where the staff member might be hurting that relationship or de-emphasizing that debriefing process. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to type in some responses. All right, I see a few coming in here. Let's take a look at the question and answer box.
Too much talking, not enough listening.
Oh, too much talking and not enough listening, right? Which is certainly a key ingredient to being supportive, and part of the debriefing process and orienting the facts is we certainly need to listen. This was a situation where the staff member seemed to think they already had the information, so was doing a lot more talking than listening in this debriefing process. Let's see what else is coming in.
Dismissive.
Oh,
The staff was
the staff was dismissive, right? Really wasn't taking it seriously or important, or again, listening to that individual, and was just kind of dismissing that student's feelings or emotions.
Staff was taking it personally.
Staff was definitely taking it personally in that situation, and he started to try to describe the methodology of why he seats people in certain areas and started to defend himself and take things personally.
Interrupted.
And he interrupted, right? That was another one that occurred. It seemed like the student or the individual in care was ready to talk, but it was the staff member who interrupted and ended up minimizing that debriefing process.
And devalued.
And devalued. That's another one that came in, was not devaluing the individual. All right, thank you for that. So let's do the same thing. Let's watch another video, the same individual, but let's take a look at it this time and say, what is the staff member doing to actually build this relationship and restore this relationship, which is a key component to therapeutic rapport, and what are they doing to maximize that debriefing process? So what are they doing to build the relationship and maximize the debriefing process?
So, Evie, tell me exactly what happened.
But he called me names and I hit him back.
Right.
Then I told you to shut up and then I pushed the table over.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Evie, I want you to think about who was affected by these actions.
I think Bertie, me and you.
Okay, anyone else?
And the class.
In the class as well. There's quite a lot of people though, isn't there, that have been affected. Okay. So, Evie, I want you to think about how that they were affected.
All right, so just like we've been doing, why don't you go ahead and think about and type in that question and answer. Where were some places that you saw the staff member this time able to build or restore that relationship with the student or the individual, and we're even actually maximizing that debriefing process? So take about 30 seconds and type in some of your responses, and then we'll share some of those responses. All right, are some of them starting to come in now?
Much better nonverbals.
Much better nonverbals, yes. Just the way the staff member was seated, the position, their posture, their proximity, his facial expressions seem much more supportive and open to that individual.
Good wait time, reflection time.
Good wait time. We had talked about that, I think, with setting limits as a strategy, that wait time. And he would certainly pose a question and then provide time for the girl to answer and respond to that. So an excellent job waiting.
Used restatement, thanked the girl.
Used restatement to make sure that he understood what she was saying. And then what was the other one?
Thanked her.
Oh, and thanked her. Yes, he thanked her for that conversation and for sharing that information. All right, is there one more in there?
Lots more. Calm, less judgmental, listened well.
Calm, less judgmental, listened. Those were all things that staff member was displaying to be able to build that relationship and maximize that debriefing process. And as I listen to that list, and as that list comes in, it's just a reminder to me how many of those are actually things that we have talked about in the program around being supportive and strategies that we can use throughout the crisis. And we're just revisiting them right there again at that postvention. All right, so Think about how postvention happens regularly and effectively at your facility. Hopefully it is. And I want you to share with us how you think you can make the postvention an emphasis of your training. Like I said, we have a tendency to lose focus of this one. We're tired. It's the end of the training. We shortchange things. What are some things that you're doing to find success that puts this at the forefront and how you can really maximize this as a trainer? So go ahead and type in some responses and we'll share a couple of the ways that you're really emphasizing this in your trainings. All right, let's check the question and answer box.
Allowing enough time in a training to cover it appropriately.
Oh, yes, allowing enough time within your training to cover it appropriately. It takes a little bit of planning, right? It's knowing your time as a trainer and staying on track to be able to do this one justice at the end of the training. So if you're going to do justice at the end, it starts from the beginning, monitoring your time and making sure that you're staying on your agenda and your schedule.
Role-playing incidents.
Role-playing incidents. I think that's a great way to really bring this one alive and make it an emphasis. You can role-play an incident and then use the coping model as a way to start to debrief that actual incident in the role-play. Great.
Making sure staff knows it's for them as well, not just the client.
Yes, making sure that staff knows that it's for them as well. It's not just something for the client or for the individual. It is also to help staff and for them to see returns as well, to be able to make sure that crisis situations are prevented in the future. All right, thanks for sharing those ideas. I really appreciate everything coming into the question and answer box. So what are some of the next steps? I think we've really shared some great information here today on the foundation of the program and how we can tie everything together throughout the program. We've shared some different ways that we can maximize that as trainers, and we've looked at principle-based learning. The next step for this is that you are going to be sent a link for an online exam that is going to, as instructors, show your competency in the content and the material. And then you are also going to be following up with your global instructor coach this week, who will be setting up some time on Thursday or Friday to work with you on an individual basis, where you will demonstrate some of your teaching and also working in teaching of the physicals that we went through this week. So hopefully you take some of the concepts that we talked about today and are able to interweave that into your discussions with your coach later this week. And once you've taken that exam and prepared and done your one-to-one consultation with your global instructor coach, you will then be certified and renewed as an instructor. So really excited about this process. So I want to thank all of you for being part of our first group here to go through the virtual training. We're really excited about this opportunity to continue working with you as certified instructors. We want to thank you for all that you do as certified instructors out there, and good luck training. Thanks for everything that you guys do.